Imagine walking into a store, minding your own business, just looking around, and the next thing you know, you're being accused of stealing. That's exactly what happened to 16-year-old Jordan, a black teenager who just wanted to grab a few snacks before heading home. But before he could even reach the register, a cop stormed in, grabbed him by the arm, and accused him of shoplifting. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his grip tightening on Jordan's wrist. The store went silent. Customers turned their heads, shocked. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't even touched anything yet, but none of that seemed to matter. To this officer, Jordan was guilty the moment he walked through the door. "I didn't steal anything," Jordan stammered, his voice shaking with fear and frustration. But the cop wasn't listening. He was too busy forcing Jordan toward the front of the store, treating him like a criminal in front of everyone. The store manager rushed over, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Jordan and the officer. "This kid was caught shoplifting," the officer snapped. "I saw him stuffing something in his pockets." Jordan's eyes widened. "That's not true." He looked around, desperate for someone to believe him. But the officer had already made up his mind. What he didn't know, what he never could have guessed, was that Jordan's father owned this very store, and he was just moments away from walking in. The tension was thick, the air heavy with judgment and fear. The officer tightened his grip, reaching for his radio. Jordan's face burned with humiliation. The customers whispered among themselves, watching as if this were just another everyday scene. But in just a few seconds, everything was about to change. Because when Jordan's father stepped through those doors and saw what was happening to his son, the officer was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Just as the officer reached for his handcuffs, the front door swung open. A tall man in a sharp suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the store. The moment he saw Jordan being restrained, his face darkened. "Jordan," his voice cut through the silence, firm and demanding. Jordan turned, relief washing over him. "Dad." The officer barely spared the man a glance. "Sir, step back. I'm in the middle of handling a shoplifter." Jordan's father, Mr. Carter, took a slow step forward, his voice calm but sharp. "A shoplifter." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "And what exactly did you see him steal?" The officer tightened his grip on Jordan's arm. "I saw him stuffing something in his pocket." Mr. Carter folded his arms, his eyes locked onto the officer. "And did you check his pockets?" The officer hesitated. He hadn't. He had been so sure, so convinced by his own assumptions, that he hadn't even bothered to confirm the accusation. One of the store employees, a young woman behind the counter, finally spoke up. "Jordan didn't steal anything," she said nervously. "He just walked in a few minutes ago." The officer's jaw clenched. "Look, I saw what I saw." Mr. Carter took another step forward, his voice like steel. "You saw what you wanted to see." The customers murmured amongst themselves. The atmosphere in the store had shifted. The officer, who had come in feeling powerful and in control, suddenly felt all eyes on him, not with support, but suspicion. Jordan swallowed hard, still feeling the officer's grip on his arm. "Dad, I swear I didn't do anything." "I know," Mr. Carter said without hesitation. Then he turned back to the officer. "You need to let my son go, now." The officer hesitated. He was still holding on to Jordan, but the confidence in his stance was slipping. "I'm just doing my job." Mr. Carter's voice remained steady. "And what job is that? Harassing innocent kids who happen to be in your way?" The silence in the store was deafening. The officer had no idea who he had just messed with. The officer's grip finally loosened, but he didn't let go. His eyes darted around the store, searching for some kind of support, some justification for his actions. But the energy in the room had shifted. The customers weren't on his side. The store employees weren't backing him up. And Mr. Carter, he wasn't someone to brush off. "I need you to release my son," Mr. Carter repeated, his voice unwavering. The officer let out a sharp breath. "Look, sir, I don't know who you are, But you don't know who I am, Mr. Carter cut in, raising an eyebrow. That's interesting, because you're standing in my store, accusing my son of a crime he didn't commit. The officer blinked. Your store. Mr. Carter gestured around. That's right, Carter's Market. Maybe you've heard of it. A murmur spread through the store. Some customers exchanged glances, watching to see how the officer would respond. His posture stiffened, but his hand finally dropped from Jordan's arm. Jordan exhaled, rubbing his wrist where the officer had held him. The tightness in his chest hadn't fully eased. Even though he was free, the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on him. I was just following protocol, the officer muttered, but there was less confidence in his voice now. Protocol, Mr. Carter echoed, his gaze hard. Is that what you call grabbing a kid before checking the facts? Or do you only apply that protocol to certain kids? The officer's face darkened. I don't profile people. Mr. Carter tilted his head slightly, the doubt clear in his expression. Then explain to me why, out of all the customers in here, my son was the one you assumed was stealing. For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. The tension in the air was suffocating. One of the customers, an older woman near the produce section, finally spoke up. He wasn't even near the shelves. He was just standing there when you grabbed him. Another voice chimed in, a man near the drinks aisle. You never even asked him anything. You just assumed. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The situation was slipping further out of his control. Mr. Carter crossed his arms. So, officer, what happens now? The officer's radio crackled. A call from dispatch. A reminder that the world outside this store was still moving. But inside these walls, the weight of what had just happened wasn't going away. The officer's face tightened, his grip shifting nervously on his radio. The whole store was watching, waiting. He had come in expecting a quick, easy arrest, an open and shut case. But now, standing in the middle of a store he had no idea was owned by the very boy he had accused, his confidence was cracking. Jordan stood beside his father, his pulse still racing. He wanted to speak, to demand an apology, but his throat felt tight. It wasn't just about this one moment. It was about everything that led up to it. The way people like this officer looked at him, judged him before he even opened his mouth. It was exhausting. Mr. Carter exhaled slowly, keeping his anger in check. I'll ask you again, officer, he said, his voice even. What happens now? The officer squared his shoulders. I was just doing my job, he said, though the words felt weaker this time. Your job. Mr. Carter repeated. Tell me, does your job include grabbing innocent teenagers without evidence, humiliating them in front of a crowd, or does it just include making assumptions? The officer clenched his jaw, shifting on his feet. His radio crackled again, another call from dispatch. He was stuck. If he walked away now, he would have to admit he was wrong. But if he doubled down, he'd have to explain why he arrested the son of a respected businessman without cause. A store employee, a young man wearing an apron, cleared his throat. I was at the counter when Jordan walked in. He didn't take anything. He didn't even go near the shelves. More murmurs rippled through the store. The customers weren't just witnesses anymore. They were turning into a jury, and the officer was on trial. Jordan took a slow breath and finally spoke. You didn't even check the cameras, did you? His voice was quiet but firm. You just assumed. The officer's eyes flickered to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the store. The realization settled over him like a weight. He hadn't checked. He hadn't asked questions. He had walked in with his mind already made up. Mr. Carter stepped forward, close enough that the officer had no choice but to meet his eyes. If you had treated my son like any other customer, he said, his voice calm but sharp, we wouldn't be standing here right now. The officer swallowed hard. He knew he had messed up. But the question was, what was he going to do about it? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his radio. His pride was on the line, but so was his authority. The murmurs of the customers weren't dying down. They were growing louder. He needed to get control of the situation fast. "I was responding to a call," he said stiffly. "Someone reported a shoplifter." Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Oh, and who made that call?" The store fell silent. Jordan's heart pounded as he glanced around. He hadn't seen anyone acting suspiciously when he walked in, just regular customers moving through the aisles. The officer hesitated. He hadn't actually spoken to the caller himself, just received the report through dispatch. He turned toward the store manager. "Wasn't it you?" The manager shook his head quickly. "No, sir. We didn't report anything. We didn't even know there was a problem until you showed up." A heavy pause filled the air. The officer's face paled slightly. If no one here had called, then where had the report come from? Jordan's mind raced. Then suddenly, a voice spoke from the back of the store. "I did." Everyone turned. A middle-aged man wearing a suit stepped forward from near the dairy section, his phone still in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes. Mr. Carter folded his arms. "And who exactly are you?" The man smirked slightly. "Just a concerned citizen." He turned toward the officer. "I saw him come in, looking around like he was up to something. Figured it was better to be safe than sorry." Jordan felt his stomach drop. He had never seen this man in his life. "So let me get this straight," Mr. Carter said, his voice dangerously calm. "You called the police because a black teenager walked into a store." The man shrugged, unfazed. He looked suspicious. The tension in the store snapped tight, like a wire pulled to its limit. Jordan clenched his fists at his sides, anger bubbling in his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand to know why this stranger had singled him out. The officer turned to the man, his confidence starting to return. "See, I was acting on a report." Mr. Carter's jaw tightened. A report based on nothing but prejudice. Jordan's breathing grew heavy. The humiliation, the fear, the rage, it all came flooding back at once. But as he looked at his father, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something much bigger. And the fight wasn't over yet. The store was dead silent. All eyes were on the man who had just admitted to making the call. His face showed no regret, no second thoughts, just a casual shrug, as if what he had done meant nothing. Jordan's chest tightened. He had been humiliated, grabbed, treated like a criminal, all because this man had decided he looked suspicious. Mr. Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You put my son through this for nothing. The officer, now standing straighter, cleared his throat. "Sir, if there was a report, I had to investigate." Mr. Carter turned to him, his eyes burning. "No, you chose to believe that man without question. You chose to treat my son like a suspect instead of a customer." The officer opened his mouth, but had no real defense. The weight of his mistake was settling in. Jordan finally found his voice. "Did you even check the cameras?" The officer hesitated, then looked at the manager. The store manager nodded and quickly pulled up the security footage on his phone. Everyone leaned in as the video played. There it was, Jordan walking in, hands in his hoodie pockets. He danced around, not in suspicion, but just looking at the store like any normal customer. He didn't touch a single item. The footage confirmed everything. The officer's face turned stiff. Mr. Carter took a step closer. "Now what?" "My son was never stealing. That man," he gestured toward the caller, "falsely reported a crime. And you, officer, acted without proof." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I." Before he could finish, another voice cut through. "Actually," the store employee said, looking at the screen, he was stealing." All heads turned toward the suited man. "What?" The man scoffed, his confidence slipping. The employee rewound the footage and pointed at the screen. Just minutes before Jordan had walked in, The man had been at the back of the store, slipping a small item into his coat pocket. The irony hit all at once. The man who had called in a false report, the one who had assumed Jordan was a thief, was the actual shoplifter. Mr. Carter let out a dry laugh. So, officer, looks like you have a real case to handle. The officer's face burned red. He turned to the man, now shifting uneasily on his feet. Sir, I'm going to need you to empty your pockets. The man stammered, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. Now, the officer said, his voice firm. Reluctantly, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, expensive bottle of cologne, one sold right near the checkout counter. The store gasped. The officer exhaled, his jaw tightening. He had been played. Mr. Carter looked at his son and nodded. Looks like justice has a funny way of working itself out. Jordan watched as the officer placed the man in handcuffs, the very same ones he had nearly used on him. It wasn't the apology he deserved, but in that moment he knew one thing for sure. He had never been the problem, and now everyone knew it. As the officer led the real shoplifter toward the front of the store, the energy in the room shifted. The customers who had been silent before were now whispering, shaking their heads at the irony of it all. Jordan stood still, watching the scene unfold, but he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt exhausted. The officer paused before walking out the door, glancing back at Mr. Carter and Jordan. There was something in his expression, something close to regret, but he didn't say anything. He just gave a stiff nod before stepping outside with the man in cuffs. Mr. Carter let out a slow breath, turning to his son. You okay? Jordan nodded. He wasn't sure if it was true. I just don't get it, he muttered. I didn't do anything wrong. His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I know, and so does everyone else now. The store manager cleared his throat, stepping forward. Jordan, I'm really sorry about what happened. This should have never gone that far. The employees nodded in agreement, and some of the customers even offered quiet apologies, as if realizing they had stood by and watched when they could have spoken up sooner. Jordan looked around at all the faces. For the first time since the officer had grabbed him, he felt like he was being seen for who he really was, not just someone to be judged at a glance. As they walked toward the exit, his father turned to him with a small smile. You handled yourself well today. Jordan sighed. I shouldn't have to handle things like this. Mr. Carter nodded. You're right, but the world's still catching up. And until it does, we stand tall. Jordan stepped outside, feeling the fresh air hit his face. The sirens in the distance faded, and the store behind him returned to normal. But he knew he wouldn't forget this moment. Maybe the officer wouldn't either. Maybe next time, he'd think twice before making a snap judgment. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the start of something better.